Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sylvia DiPietro, the district leader of Chelsea Reform Democratic Club, and it's my pleasure to welcome all present to CRDC and Hell's Kitchen Democrats' final forum dedicated to the 2021 political races in New York City. This afternoon, our forum focuses on the 2021 race for mayor of the city of New York. Presenters this afternoon of questions are my co-leader, Stephen Skiles Mulligan, Nick Franklin, the president of Hell's Kitchen Democratic Club, Mindy Rosier, the president of Chelsea Reform Democratic Club, Marissa Redanti, district leader from Hell's Kitchen, and her co-leader, Paul Devlin, and myself. The candidates are here today because they all qualified for public financing matching funds as of the latest report filing date of January 15th. There are many other candidates, but we restricted ourselves to these candidates. Now for the ground rules. Each candidate will be given 2 minutes for an introduction statement. That will be followed by 6 rounds of questions to be asked by 4 district leaders and 2 club presidents. The candidates will have 90 seconds each to answer each question posed to them. Candidates will then be given 1 minute each for closing statements. The 6 rounds of questions will cover state-federal relations, public safety, the arts, education, housing and homelessness, and land use, with a question in each category for each candidate. Questions were solicited from the membership of both clubs, then developed and screened by the district leaders and the club presidents. Candidates are restricted to answering only the questions posed to them. No question will be taken from the audience. The order in which candidates will be called upon has been set up using a randomizer with some manual tweaking to ensure that each candidate will go first at least once, second at least once, and so forth until last at least once. Candidates will not know the order until they are called upon. Paulette Osborne from Hell's Kitchen Dems will be the timekeeper. She will flash a 10-second card as a warning, then announce time at the end of the time allotment. Candidates are asked to respect the calling of time so we can get through all of the questions. For the audience, we are using a Zoom webinar format, so the only people visible to the audience should be the candidates, the questioners, the timekeeper, and our technical support. The chat feature will only be visible to Nick and Mark to address technical issues. Chat will not be used to address, will not be used for running commentary so that we can focus on the candidates and their answers. It's my pleasure at this time to introduce the first candidate, Maya Wiley, who has 2 minutes to introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. And let me just start by saying I'm running to be the next mayor of New York City as an untraditional candidate because I believe and know that we can be a city where we can all live with dignity. And I do mean all of us. I mean, no matter what we look like, no matter who we love, whether we have a big bank account or no bank account at all. And dignity means things like developing without displacement. It means seeing every last one of our children as exceptional. It means having public safety, both safety from crime, but also safety from police violence, and much, much more. I'm running because as someone who has spent 30 years as a racial justice advocate, including 2.5 in City Hall. I know what it means to develop policies and also to implement them that are transformative and support dignity. And I was grateful for the opportunity to do things like get every single resident of Queensbridge houses, the largest public housing development in North America, free broadband. And that was showing the government it could do something it had never done before. And it did require marshaling the resources of government to do something transformational. We'll talk more about that later, I'm sure, but let me just say that what's critical to me is to lead in a way that listens, that learns, and that leads in partnership, because that's how we're going to get change done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now turn, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ray McGuire. Up, unmute.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
How are you? I am Ray McGuire, and I'm running for mayor because I have what it takes to lead our city out of the economic crisis, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and a host of other factors have taken our city in the wrong direction. I know what it's like to not have. I grew up on the other side of the tracks with my single mother who raised me and my two brothers, along with my grandparents, in a house that had half a dozen foster children at any one point in time. Education was my way out. I know what it's like not to have. I know what it's like to wash tin foil, or my mother had to debate whether or not she put food on the table or paid the gas and electric bill. I know what that's like. And so I know education. When I left home, I came to New York. It was education. I came to New York with three things. I had a great education. I had no money and had lots of debt. And I came here and I was able to be successful in the most competitive fields that exist anywhere. And so that lived experience, plus what I've been able to do in business, managing budgets that are often larger than state budgets, making certain that capital got allocated to large and small businesses, empowering small businesses so that they could not only survive, but to grow. And my plan is to take the lived experiences, take what I've been able to accomplish in business, and apply that in the relationships I've been able to develop to lead the greatest inclusive economic comeback in the history of this city. That means a plan that is at its priority, the economy, no jobs, no city. Then it's safety, safety and quality of life, and then it's education. So it's on that platform that I intend to lead the greatest economic comeback in the history of this city. So thank you for having me, and I'm prepared to do what it takes to get your endorsement. Thank you.
And now we'll turn to Zachary Ischol.
Thank you for having me today. It's particularly exciting for me to be with the Hell's Kitchen Democrats, also Chelsea, but my grandmother was from Hell's Kitchen. I got asked on a candidate forum a couple of weeks ago, or earlier this week, who your most important New Yorker is. For me, it was my grandma, Sylvia. She grew up cold and hungry in Hell's Kitchen during the Great Depression, and she was everything to me. I am new to politics. I'm not new to public service. I have led in the nonprofit sector, I've led in the business community, and I've led in government. And it is going to take all three to bring this city back. My service started in the Marine Corps. I was in the infantry and special operations. I led troops through some of the heaviest combat of the Iraq War. Over the last 10 years, I've built a number of multi-million-dollar businesses and a nonprofit. One of those businesses has helped tens of thousands of people transition into new careers. And the nonprofit, the Headstrong Project, one of the things I am most proud of in my life, is one of the leading and largest providers of mental health care in the United States. And most recently, on March 27th, I went to Javits Medical Center as a volunteer. I walked into an environment that I am very familiar with, 28 federal, state, and city agencies, some of the best people I have worked with in my life, but they weren't working together. A few days later, the governor's office asked me to step in as a deputy director. It's a story that hasn't really been told, but I helped lead the turnaround of Javits into one of the only successful COVID field hospitals in the country. And that has really been the story of my career, stepping in where government has fallen short, marshaling resources, bringing people together to solve big problems. I did it in Iraq, bringing together local tribes, insurgent groups to keep the peace in one of the most dangerous parts of Iraq. I did it when I came home. I suffered from post-traumatic stress. I suffered from sleepless nights. But more importantly, I struggled to, and I was fortunate. I was able to get the help that I needed, but many of my Marines were not. Many of my fellow veterans were not. And we built an entirely new model of care when we couldn't get them through the bureaucracy of the VA to provide them the care that they needed at Headstrong. and then I did it again at Javits Medical Center, and I plan on doing it here in New York City as the next mayor of New York. Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's a pleasure to introduce Scott Stringer.
Well, thank you so much. And it's great to be here with all of you once again. As you all know, I'm running for mayor, and I'm running because we're facing three crises at the same time: a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a social justice crisis. We need a mayor with both the vision and the skills to tackle all three. And we have seen mayors who did not always share our progressive values. And we've seen what happens when City Hall is incapable of managing anything really. So I believe we shouldn't have to choose. We need a mayor who's going to make New York a more just and equitable place. And we need a mayor who's going to manage the hell out of this city. And many of you know me and you know my record. As an assembly member, I was willing to stand up to two different speakers from my own party. When they cut deals with the landlord lobby that were bad for tenants, I fought against the Pataki tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires. As Manhattan Borough President, we fought overcrowding in schools, getting elementary schools up and down the borough. And as controller, I've launched divestments from private prisons and fossil fuel companies. I protected the retirement security of our workers, and I've been the city's chief watchdog. And so you know that I know how to get things done for working families. And you know that I'm not going to get my lunch money stolen in Albany. You also know that I'm not going to let the entry price for the city continue to be a $2 million condo in the post-COVID recovery. Now, they do say that the job of mayor is the second toughest job in America. Well, let's face it, it's never been tougher. And for me, this is very personal. My mom contracted COVID in the early days of the pandemic. She was sent to a Bronx hospital, and I had to explain to my sons why there was no closure. This happened to families all over the city. COVID was a great discriminator. It hurt our Black and brown communities in ways we could not have imagined. And I believe the next mayor cannot reopen this economy the same way we closed it. And if I'm mayor, I'm not going to let that happen. And I'm running for mayor because as a kid who grew up in Washington Heights, who got involved in politics early, many of you know I campaigned for my cousin Bella Abzug when she was running. And my own mom was a single parent running for city council. And what I've always loved about the city of 8 million is there's a story with each and every one of us, how we marvel at the city's recovery.
Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Shaun Donovan.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here with you all today, and especially my good friend Marissa Rodanti, who I worked with to save Manhattan Plaza when that affordable housing for our artists, for our performers, was at risk of being lost forever to affordable housing. So it's wonderful to be with you.
Thank you.
I'm a lifelong public servant because I grew up in this city in a time of crisis. I watched homelessness exploding on the streets around me as a child walking to school and asked myself, how can it be in the wealthiest city, in the wealthiest country on earth, that we let New Yorkers sleep on our streets? I watched the South Bronx, Harlem, Central Brooklyn, so many other communities of color crumbling, literally burning to the ground. And it lit a fire in me to go to work on behalf of the city that I love. Started volunteering in a homeless shelter. When I finished school, I came back, started working at a nonprofit in the Bronx and Central Brooklyn to rebuild those communities with community leaders like Bishop Reverend Johnny Ray Youngblood and Ana Vicente of Nos Quedamos. That began a 30-year career of public service where I learned what it means to lead through crisis. I was housing commissioner in this city in the wake of 9/11. I was asked by President Obama to become housing secretary in the midst of the worst housing crisis of our lifetimes. When Sandy hit our shores and my neighbors in Brooklyn lost their homes and their jobs, a friend even lost his daughter in the storm, President Obama asked me to lead the entire federal recovery effort. And when Ebola hit and I'd become budget director, I was in the Situation Room side by side with Dr. Fauci, our military leaders, President Obama, Vice President Biden, making sure that a worldwide global health threat didn't become a pandemic that cost tens of thousands of New Yorkers their lives. What I've learned in all those crises is that those who are the most vulnerable before a crisis are always hurt the worst. That's why I led the strategy that dramatically reduced homelessness around this country. It's why I was the first cabinet secretary ever to endorse marriage equality. And it's why I've been a leader on racial equity. I believe I can be a mayor that can reimagine this city for everyone. Thank you.
And now I'd like to turn to Eric Adams.
Thank you so much for having me to be on with you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I've shared with this club before, and I will share it again with all those who are on. I think stories determine our vision. People say that competency is on the ballot. I believe character is also on the ballot. When I think about the time as I talk about dropping my son off to school and questioning the head of the school over and over again, just for him to place his hands on my shoulders and tell me that he dropped his daughter off to school in Carolina. I smiled at that time because I realized that he understood I was going through separation anxiety. Watching my son with hair on his face, his voice was deeper, but he was still my baby. And I was not willing to turn over my son to someone that didn't understand the depth of my investment. I can't place my hands on your shoulders, New Yorkers, but I can tell you this, just as he got it, I get it. I get it, you're watching open defecation in our streets, open urination, homelessness, drug use right in front of your schools. Crime is going up. 1-year-old children are being shot in our streets. I get it that we saw PPP come to the city, but didn't go to small businesses. I get it that 65% of Black children don't meet proficiency in our school system. If you don't educate, you will incarcerate. I turned this city around as a police officer. I wore a bulletproof vest for 22 years and protected the children and families of the city. I know when the city goes to a level of depth that it is now. Yes, I'm gonna put together the best team to manage this city, but not manage it just to exist. Our inefficiencies are creating the inequalities and injustices. It's time for someone with a real leadership that's going to work as hard as New Yorkers are working. I'm the person to do that.
Thank you. And we'll now turn to Dianne Morales.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a first generation Puerto Rican, born and raised in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, to a working class family. I'm also the single mother of 2 children with learning differences, one of whom struggles with mental health challenges, and the other who's been racially profiled and assaulted by the NYPD in front of my very own eyes. I've lived inequities in education, the health and mental health systems, and policing as I struggled to balance my role as head of household while holding down a job to provide for my family. I got into this race because the combination of my lived and professional experiences have never been reflected in our city's leadership. A year ago, I thought that would be an important factor in moving the city towards better representation, which would ultimately benefit everyone. But now, after living through the intersection of the COVID pandemic with the racial justice and the economic pandemics that predated it, it feels even clearer that our response cannot be to go back to normal or the status quo. The time is now for us to decide if tomorrow will be a future where we can all win, for us to have the moral and the political courage to prioritize the poor, to stabilize as many lives as quickly as we can, and to radicalize the systems that require dismantling, not just reform. We are at a crossroads, and it's time for us to honor those who continue to make it possible for the city to operate and for so many of us to work from home. Black and brown men and women, immigrants, and the working class. We must commit to a new social contract that recognizes our collective interdependence. New York City needs leadership that is unapologetic about the need for change. I'm not afraid to challenge the status quo. I'm not promising to get New York City back to normal. I am promising to help us build a New York City that has never existed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, Kathryn Garcia. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me on this important forum today. I'm Kathryn Garcia. I'm running for New York City Mayor, and you may not recognize my name, but you recognize my work. I have been responsible for delivering clean drinking water, ensuring that our harbors were clean, ensuring that your garbage got picked up, and ensuring that your snow got plowed. And during COVID, tasked with delivering over 130 million meals to our most vulnerable and our sick. I got into this race in October because I have a vision of rebuilding this economy and really focused on the things that make New York special. arts and culture, restaurants, as we go forward. Such critical pieces of employment for so many New Yorkers, because if you don't have a job, nothing is affordable. But these things can't get done if we don't deliver critical city services effectively. And that means people need to feel safe in their communities. That means kids need to be getting an education. That means the streets need to be clean. We cannot have open drug use on the streets of New York. I am a lifelong Brooklynite and grew up in a multiracial family. I'm one of 3 who were adopted, a product of the public school system, and I love this city. I know we can thrive, and I have a vision for how we can get back on our feet and go even further than we've ever gone before. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. At this time, I'm going to turn the questioning over to my co-leader, Stephen Skiles Mulligan.
Thank you, Sylvia. This section is going to cover public safety and related issues. You will all get a different question and you'll have, what is it, 90 seconds, do we say? Okay.
Yes. 90.
All right. First question goes 1 minute. Thank you. Thank you, Mindy.
Sorry.
1 minute. Okay. These are big questions, so you're going to have to talk fast. Mr. McGuire, the first question goes to you, and my email tells me I'm supposed to wish you and Arturo Schomburg happy birthday today. So
Thank you. To be in the company of Arturo Schomburg is to be in the company of greatness. So thank you very much.
you're very welcome.
Happy birthday, Ray.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Birthday.
Thank you.
Happy
I
birthday.
must, and I also must apologize to the group that at 3 o'clock I have a prior commitment, so I'm going to have to excuse myself. But
Okay.
also I will tell you that I used to live on 22nd Street and 8th Avenue, so I know the
Okay.
neighborhood quite well.
Good-
Yes,
good
sir.
to know. Let's move on with it, sir. I don't want to take this out of your time. Broken windows policing is credited with the reduction in violent crime, beginning maybe with the Dinkins administration, but it also frequently seems to be a starting point for the kinds of confrontations between police and community members that turn violent. Are there benefits to the broken windows approach to law enforcement? And if so, how do we keep them while reducing the possibility for fatal confrontation? And if not, how do we find a new enforcement model that works better?
Broken windows and stop and frisk has had such material negative impact on Black and brown boys for years. There is no way that we can profile 750 to 1 million kids whose lives have been so negatively impacted by policy such as that. We need to change the culture of the police department. We need to return to community policing. We need to invest in the mental health organizations that can intervene where we don't need the police. We need to invest in those violent interrupter organizations that can help us prevent the crime. And we also need to invest in our youth by giving them jobs so that it doesn't go from being distracted to getting into trouble. And so I would say, let's have a program that starts with education. I go from cradle to career, cradle to job, to make sure that we invest in our youth and so that we do not have to have programs like broken windows and stop and frisk.
Thank you. Next question is for Controller Stringer. Hey, Scott. How do we determine what is the right amount to spend on policing? And how would you go about reviewing and reallocating the police budget?
Well, first of all, let me just say a quick happy birthday to Ray McGuire. It's also good to be here in Chelsea with you, Stephen. You know, my 2 little kids go to PS33, so I feel like I'm a Chelsea parent, if nothing else. But look, this is going to be the real challenge here. You know, as controller, I've said in the midst of this pandemic that we have to find efficiencies in every city agency so that we don't have to make the false choice of cutting services for kids or laying off city workers. And there is waste to be cut at the NYPD. I proposed those cuts during the last budget battle. And I believe that when you look at waste, we can get there and have a more leaner policing by shifting police responsibilities to where we really need the police. We should take the savings from that strategy and invest in our communities. We should be building out our mental health professionals and social service workers to go into communities to keep kids away from the criminal justice system. They're doing this in Eugene, Oregon. They're doing this around the country. And because the mayor lost control of the police department, we are not having the thoughtful view of how we can help people and keep them away from the criminal justice system. So this is going to be an ongoing discussion with the budget, but as controller, I put pen to paper. I looked how we could cut $1 billion over 4 years. I think we can do that in a way that's responsible and creates equitable policing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Next question is for Mr. Donovan. How do we sort out what problems are appropriate for law enforcement to solve, and how do we create alternative structures to effectively relieve them of responsibilities that are not appropriate for them?
Stephen, it's such an important question because I think this is a source of so much conflict in communities, particularly Black and brown communities, is that we are asking police to take roles that are much more effectively done by others. We should not have the police patrolling the hallways of our schools. We should not have the police criminalizing homelessness. My sister's a psychiatrist who worked on a street team in New York and in supportive housing. I know that there are alternatives. I've worked to create those all around the country. I led the strategy for President Obama that dramatically reduced homelessness because we treated homelessness and mental health, substance abuse problems as health problems, not as criminal problems. So we need to get those systems in place. I'm the only candidate in this race who's actually worked with mayors across the country and the globe to implement those kind of solutions. It's why we dramatically reduced homelessness under President Obama. Those are the types of things that we can do to get the police out of situations and focus on guns and violent crime.
Thank you.
Okay. Next question is for Borough President Adams. Obviously, we can't talk about issues in public safety without putting racial disparity at the forefront. We all saw a few weeks ago that a violent mob consisting of white supremacists was greeted by rather lackluster police, whereas just a few weeks prior to that, a peaceful Black Lives Matter protest was greeted by the same police force in riot gear. How do we effectively identify the underlying mindset that leads police to treat communities of color differently? How do we re-educate those in law enforcement who can be re-educated, and how do we throw out the bums who can't be re-educated?
Well, I think the starting place is to elect a mayor like Eric Adams that not only put on the blue uniform, but that experienced the abuse by police, being arrested as a child, beat by police. Didn't say, woe is me. I said, why not me? Started 100 Blacks in law enforcement after civil rights activists asked me to go into policing. Then we look towards the first woman police commissioner that I'm going to hire and have her at the helm of the largest police department in the entire country. And you start to having a different mindset of identifying during the psychological process, the profile of people who are abusive, have a low tolerance or zero tolerance. It should not take 4 years to get rid of those officers like Pandaleo, who was around for 4 years after taking the life of Eric Gardner. It's about being more proactive and not reactive, and it starts with the right mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is for Ms. Morales. How do we effectively turn off the spigot on the school to prison pipeline while maintaining safety in the schools and ensuring that our kids get what they need to better their lives?
Thank you for that important question. I think the first move is to remove police from schools and reinvest those dollars in the kinds of services and programming that really help our children thrive. We need to provide quality education. We need to provide mental health services. We need to expand access to recreation and arts. We need to provide job training for our students in our public schools. We need to expose them to the world at large. We really need to invest and focus in on fundamentally transforming what our schools look like and the opportunities and access that the schools provide our students. I have long called for the creation, the sort of reorganization of our school curriculum under 3 core pillars: civic and democratic literacy, financial literacy, and digital and technological literacy. And I think by providing that transformation and exposing children to the city as a classroom, we can go a long way to help provide experiences that are much more worthwhile.
Thank you. Next question is for Zach. What steps would you take early on in your administration to improve accountability for officers who mistreat members of the community?
Thank you. It's a really important question. I've led military units at home and abroad. I've built military units around the world. One of the things that separates good military units from bad ones is a culture of accountability. And so it really is that simple. I mean, Eric said it best. It should not take 4 years to hold somebody like Daniel Pantaleo accountable. That should happen immediately. On top of that, one of the other things I would say is that you, as a leader, look for opportunities to demonstrate a culture of accountability. For example, something like placard corruption, right? The symbolism of a mayor showing up with a tow truck and towing cars, that are guilty of or that have abused their placard, abused the public trust. That sends a message through the ranks that as a public servant, your job is to serve the public. And so you have to look for those symbolic opportunities, as well as actually holding people accountable. And I would say that's beyond the NYPD, that extends across city government.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is for Ms. Garcia. What essential steps and approaches would you advocate to help proactively build or rebuild trust between police and communities?
Thank you for that question. It really is critical moving forward. The first piece is the public needs to see accountability of officers. When I was sanitation commissioner, if they took a black bag for $20 from a restaurant, they got fired. Those processes need to be in place, but they also need to be engaging with communities. We need our community police officers to be participating in civics and holding forums. We know that that can happen. They need to see that there is training on implicit bias, that not only is a module in the academy, but that goes further, that is part of the everyday lives of the patrol officer and is manifested in their relationship with people on the street. We know that we can do that as we move forward. And I've also advocated for increasing the age of new recruits, as well as having them live within the city. I have run a uniform agency. I understand the culture of uniform agencies, and I understand how to change the culture of uniform agencies.
Thank you. Final question in this segment goes to Ms. Wiley. Some people have advocated for replacing arrests with citations for some low-level offenses, partly in order to de-escalate tense situations. Is this an approach you favor, and are there other changes that you would make to the way that laws are enforced at street level? You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, and thank you for that question, because what we have right now is a policing of poverty rather than problem solving what's happening in people's communities and lives. And one key way to do that is to simply stop. And that's why I say we put the public back in public safety. That means a strong mayor, which is the mayor I will be, that determines with our elected leaders, with our communities, the right priorities of policing. And it is not doing what happened to Eric Garner, who was being arrested for allegedly selling an untaxed cigarette. That was at best, if he even did it, a poverty problem. And so that's something we will change with problem-oriented policing that focuses on the real crimes, not on poverty. But the other thing we have to be very clear about once we do that is not having arrest warrants for folks who simply miss their desk appearance. That's happened to my godson. It can't happen to kids who live in public housing or in any house. And we have to stop that to make that more transparent.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next round of questions will be offered by the affable and unflappable president of the Hell's Kitchen Democratic Club, Mr. Nick Franklin.
Thank you, Stephen. That sounds like a challenge. Please don't take him up on it, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Great to see you all. I also just quickly want to recognize our Assembly member, Richard Godfrey. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. HK and Chelsea are home to a vibrant community of artists and performers. So we want to put some questions to you about the arts and their place in the life of our city. And Scott, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. So the governor recently announced a plan to use rapid coronavirus tests right before a performance to allow arts venues to reopen. He said, New York City is not New York without Broadway. But with deaths and hospitalizations rising steadily again, is it wise to reopen theaters before vaccination is widespread? And you have 90 seconds to answer this question.
Well, let me just use 2 seconds to say hello to Assemblyman Gottfried, who's endorsed my candidacy. Thank you. Look, one of the ways we need to bring our city back is through arts and culture. This industry has been virtually shut down. And the way I would build it back is through the lens of what's best with medicine and through health. And obviously there's a testing component, but one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to vaccinate and inoculate, because that's how we bring the economy back. One of the things that I think we have to start thinking about is cleaning up the slow pace of the vaccines. I have a real plan to move the vaccines, fix the websites, and get people going. And I think we have to start planning foundationally now about how in the spring, just a couple of months from now, we literally move arts and cultures from indoors to outdoors, modeled after open streets and outdoor dining, outdoor retail. We should have off-Broadway and Broadway in every community. And then we have to work with the federal stimulus package, because we have got to make sure that the artists and the city hands in the back office have the ability to cancel rent and to stay in the city. That is going to be critical as well.
Thank you so much. Kathryn, you're up next. So the City Council created the innovative Open Culture program in December to stage ticketed events outdoors, just like Scott was mentioning, from March 2021, with reduced application fees and self-certification of compliance with the COVID rules. Can you think of other creative uses of city space to help get the arts back in business?
Absolutely. We need to be using all of our plazas to stage events, not only to get the people who work in the arts back employed, but also because we as New Yorkers miss it. And it feeds all of our souls to be able to participate in arts and culture. It is why we live here. It is why those of us who are not perhaps talented in this area are part of the New York City experience. And so I absolutely agree with Scott and with many on this forum that using our public spaces, our parks, our streets, to ensure that we are creating a vibrant cultural scene until we have widespread vaccine implementation is absolutely critical. We cannot lose it as we wait to get to that point in herd immunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is for Dianne. Dianne, the governor's 2021 budget reduced the New York film and TV tax credit from 30% to 25% and raised the minimum spend on what they call below the line cost to $1 million. So this was seen to support a lot of union jobs in corporate owned Hollywood productions, but it excludes a lot of vulnerable independent filmmakers and small budget productions. Do you think that was the right call to make?
That's a good question. I can't help but say, but think about how that legislation just further makes vulnerable those who are already the most vulnerable, which just further exacerbates and contributes to the conditions that have existed for a very, very long time in our society and in our city. I think about the arts and culture not just as a critical and vibrant part of our economic engine, but I also think about and value the role that they play in our education system. As someone who's a strong believer in multiple intelligences, as someone who is also the parent of 2 children with learning differences, And as someone who watched my daughter come to life in a whole different kind of way when she discovered the arts and she found herself finally feeling competent and finally being able to learn, I think it is critical that we invest in and prioritize the arts and culture industry, not just for economic purposes, but for the purposes of education as well.
Thanks. Zach, over to you next. Many people look back with nostalgia at downtown Manhattan in the 1970s as a golden era for nightlife, with artists drawn to the city by cheap rent and a vibrant underground arts and music scene. Do you think another renaissance like that is possible in the next few years?
I think it's not only possible, I think it's definite. I think this city is going to roar back to life, and I think this city wants to roar back to life. And I think we right now need to be doing everything we can to make that happen. I think one of the issues I see with a lot of my fellow candidates is we're often asked, what are you going to do day one when you're mayor? The fact is, most of us don't know how much more damage is going to be done over the next 350 something days. And so if I were mayor today, I would be doing everything possible to make sure we keep artists in this town, that we keep our restaurants and our small businesses alive through this winter, that we save Broadway, because those are the types of things that will make this city come back, that will bring that talent here. And the other thing is it's important to invest in art and culture and nightlife, because one of the things we know, there's been a lot of economic data that shows this. If you put a art or cultural institution down in a neighborhood, it irrigates a small garden of retail, small businesses, restaurants. It is one of the most important things we can do as a city to invest in bringing back businesses to this town. Thank you.
Thanks. Maya, over to you. So museums of fine art, unlike performing arts and unlike science venues, are in the unusual position of having large collections of works, which they might sell for cash relatively easily, a process called deaccessioning. And the Brooklyn Museum announced in September it was selling 12 pieces from its permanent collection of over 160,000 to help pay for operating costs. Some critics say that was an institutional and social betrayal. Do you agree?
I agree that our cultural institutions, including Brooklyn Museum, where I am a member, and that has been dear to me and my family, where my children benefited from both arts education within the museum as an arts education provider and summer camp, is a critically important institution. It's one the city has a Department of Cultural Affairs to support. We need to preserve our collection. We saw this with the city of Detroit when it faced bankruptcy. And there is a call to action that we have the opportunity to make, both because we have a private sector that's willing to step up when asked. And when I talk to business leaders, one of the failures that we've seen with the current administration is a failure to call us together, to put on the table what we have to contribute. And I also want to say one other thing about the arts, in addition to that, which is that with a child who is an artist, she doesn't know how she's going to afford to stay in the city. We have a New Deal New York policy that's going to bring 100,000 jobs, and it includes jobs for artists and creatives.
Thank you. Ray, over to you. Has the national focus on STEM education and job preparation gone too far and begun to deprive public school children of the stories and the perspectives they need to participate fully in civic life? I need you to unmute as well. Thanks.
You know, I can't tell you that it's gone too far in STEM. It must, by definition, include the arts. And I have been involved in the arts, heavily invested in the arts during my time living in New York City. I've served on at least 10 arts education and cultural boards. I have been recognized by at least 15 to 20 of those for my service to the arts and cultural community. I have personally sponsored at least 20 different exhibitions, especially every major exhibition that has taken place in this city by Black and or brown artists. So we need to make certain that we return arts and arts education to the educational system so that those people who are gifted artists have a way to have those gifts invested in. And that needs to be a fundamental part of the educational process and will be when I become mayor.
Thank you so much. Eric, over to you. The Save Our Stages Act was recently passed by Congress as part of the latest coronavirus relief bill, with $15 billion in dedicated federal funding for live venues, independent movie theaters, and cultural institutions. Do you think that was enough for New York City?
No, I don't. We must go further, and I don't know what they were waiting for. The curtain was already up. When you look at during the Great Depression, the federal government invested $27 million in the arts performance, which would be equivalent to $400 million today. We must go further. I think as Eric, as the mayor of the city, art is imperative to deal with not only performances, but also trauma. One of the fastest ways of recovering from trauma states by looking at what actually happened and using the visualization to get you through the process. So I think we could do far much more and have a great investment in our dollars in the process.
Thank you so much. So just for the attendees, I think Shaun's had to drop off briefly, so we won't be taking a question from Shaun on this topic, but I'm going to hand back to Sylvia, who's going to introduce the next subject. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. This next round is going to be dealing with state and federal relationships and relations and shared responsibilities. The candidates are given 90 seconds to answer these questions going forward. So I'm going to start with Eric Adams. As the new mayor of the city of New York, you have to work closely with Governor Cuomo and the legislature. There appears to be a schism, however, in the primary relationship and the interaction between the governor and the present mayor. There appears to be warring egos. One says open the schools, the other says close the schools. Can you tell us what steps you would take to improve the mayor's relationship with Governor Cuomo?
Yes, thank you so much. And I use the term a lot, social emotional intelligence, something that I push legislation through school for our young people. I think we as leaders must do the same. Think about this for a moment. When I was responding to jobs of shots fired, someone's being attacked, imagine my partner and I arguing on the way there as we run up the stairs to save someone's life. That is what we're doing right now. And I think the first thing that must be done, as I said to the mayor and governor, knock it off. New Yorkers are watching, they're traumatized. Many are losing loved ones, they're losing their jobs, their homes. We must look to our executive branch of government to see 3 words: we got this. We're not seeing that right now, the lack of coordination. I'm going to put my ego to the side, sit behind closed door with whomever is the chief executive, and stay together. We will lead this city out of this pandemic and whichever crisis we have. It's about social, emotional intelligence, communicating with each other, and that is what I have the ability to do.
Thank you. The next question is to Maya Wiley. Can you tell us what policies Mayor de Blasio has gotten right and what he's gotten wrong with respect to the pandemic?
Well, look, unfortunately, I've got a lot longer list of wrong. I'm not sure I have a right, so I'm not going to state one. What is so clearly wrong was we did not have a clear decision to close the schools early enough. We did not spend the summer working in partnership and seeing the partnerships both with the state, but also with parents, with educators, with principals, with the school unions around how to have teachers prepared for online learning through the summer and how to have a clear set of standards guided by public health experts, yes, and in partnership with all those stakeholders so that there was clarity around when and how schools would reopen so that we didn't see the kind of torture that we saw for parents and students. And I have to say, you know, that as we look at rollout of vaccines, that it is critically important that we see leadership that leads with the new administration in Washington as well as Albany to solve that problem. And what I saw in my own community was our faith leaders as critical partners in community-based organizations. And we have to work more effectively in partnership with them. And I think that was also an opportunity that was not sufficiently built upon. And as mayor, I will show that city government can lead differently, can lead in partnership, and can lead in ways that bring people to the table, not by just ascending folks with different decisions at different points in time with no explanation.
Thank you very much. And now I'll turn to Scott Stringer. You see, you thought you were leaving, and now I got the next question is yours.
It's hard to leave Hell's Kitchen in Chelsea.
Well, here we go. According to the present mayor, there is a $1.5 billion revenue decline due to the pandemic, driven by a $2.5 billion decline in property tax revenue that is not going to come into the city as initially expected. The present mayor maintains that this loss will partially be offset by an increase in income taxes because the quote, rich got richer during the pandemic. If the state does not receive sufficient federal stimulus, the state may try to cut aid to localities by $8 billion, which means a possible $4 billion cut for New York City. In fact, 90% of New Yorkers prefer taxing the rich instead of cutting services. What are your thoughts about increasing the level of taxation on the rich should you become our next mayor?
Well, let me first say that the mayor has proposed a balanced budget going into this fiscal year. And part of that is where we've seen loss of property tax revenue, we've also seen more revenue on the income side. So some of that is being offset, drawing down on reserves, and also the work I did as controller, refinancing debt and some pension changes. We are at a budget closure. One of the things I said early on in the pandemic, as I was analyzing the city's deficit going back to as far as March, be very careful about how we look at the budget. And this is where my expertise comes in, because the mayor wanted to borrow $5 billion to have walking around money. I said, don't borrow and create debt service. Let's do the work of efficiencies, identifying efficiencies in city agencies. And the mayor, after months and months of wrangling, finally listened to me. And we've been able to find efficiencies so we don't have to cut summer jobs or lay off city workers. Going into this cycle, the first question you asked Borough President Adams is very critical. The mayor must reset the relationship with Albany and have a strategy to deal with Albany. You can't play checkers with Governor Cuomo. You need to play chess and reset the relationship. One of the ways to do that, my strategy, is I was one of the early lone voices to support the Democratic candidates for state Senate in 2018. These were Democratic progressives who beat Democrats who caucus with Republicans. They are my allies. They are supporting me for mayor. Biaggi, Ramos, the new Democratic leadership. I'm going to partner with them to have a progressive people's budget in Albany that will help New York City.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Ray McGuire. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed deeply unequal health outcomes and access to quality health care for low-income New Yorkers and communities of color. Even President-elect Biden appears to be laser focused on America's economic recovery, which appears to begin with tackling the costs state and local governments have incurred in managing the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, 60% of New York City residents said they faced a healthcare affordability burden in the prior year. As New York's next mayor, how can you expand health coverage and access to quality care and strengthen the city's healthcare infrastructure.
Thank you for that. And excuse me, as I said before, I'm going to have to excuse myself after I'm able to respond to what is a critical question. I have written about the inequities that have existed in healthcare for quite some time. We need to repair that. The budget deficit will include in the healthcare system $1.5 to $2 billion of a deficit. If you look in the communities that have been most impacted by COVID, it's had a disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities. So we need to begin to repair this. We need to make sure that we have primary care facilities in these geographies with primary care physicians and a network that makes healthcare available to all of our citizens at an affordable rate, especially child healthcare and especially senior healthcare. So we need to make certain that we have the dollars to invest there. We also need to make certain that we invest in community organizations and community health organizations, and including making certain that we get rid of or at least address the food deserts, where we don't have healthy alternatives for diet, which then leads to conditions that are more receptive to generating the virus. So we need to address at the beginning the food deserts. We need to make certain that we give healthy alternatives to our children, especially, and to make certain that we've invested in healthcare and healthy alternatives so that we can prevent the magnitude of the impact that it's had on Black and brown communities.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Kathryn Garcia. The Transit Authority Board is dominated by 6 appointees by Governor Cuomo, who controls a plurality of its 14 votes. The mayor of the city of New York also appoints 4 members. The MTA, the operator of the nation's largest transit system, instituted a schedule a decade ago, raising the fare and toll revenues by about 4% every 2 years to keep pace with inflation. The members of the board and the governor postponed the scheduled vote to increase fares on January 18th. We know that the state-controlled MTA is desperate for revenue. It balanced its 2020 budget using a $3.9 billion federal bailout in short-term debt from the Federal Reserve's Emergency Lending Program. What action would you take as mayor to influence the MTA board to refrain from increasing fares as long as possible so that the working poor can afford the fares?
Thank you. The MTA and the subway system is key to economic mobility. It expands the labor market for anyone in the city of New York. You can get a job in Midtown, you can get a job in the Bronx, but you're going to get there on a subway. New York City's next mayor has to be working in partnership with the governor to support that system, because no New York City resident really cares who's in charge. They just want to get to work on time. And working together with the governor, we will need to find efficiencies within the transit system, but we also should be supportive of it with the city budget to the extent that we have any money. But I am hopeful that Majority Leader Schumer will actually make investments in the MTA to bail out what has really not been their fault, which is the lack of ridership. But one of the key pieces is getting people back on the subway. We need to expand vaccinating our most vulnerable and then on to the general public as fast as possible. If we are talking about the 100-day plan and 100 million doses, that is about 2.8 million doses in the city of New York that need to happen. The faster that happens, the faster we open our economy, the faster the MTA's finances stabilize.
Thank you. The next question is for Zachary Ischol. There is very little home rule on the city level with respect to healthcare. Most issues with respect to healthcare are controlled at the state level. New York City's public hospital system, which is far larger than the city's private hospital system, needs more support, especially with respect to local departments of health, delivery of the COVID-19 vaccine to the poor and needy, and contact tracing. The state is going too slow. What action or actions do you intend to take to improve the quality of healthcare and COVID-19 distribution system for needy New Yorkers?
Thank you for that question. I would hope by January 1st of next year, we have vaccinated at least 70% of New York's population. With that said, I've built the healthcare system. I did it at Javits. I also did it in building one of the leading and largest providers of mental health care. And one of the ways that we did that is we reimagined what that should look like. First off, we know that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We need to be doing things in this city to reduce the need for critical healthcare, whether it's mental health care or whether it's actual physical healthcare in the emergency room. That's things like addressing food deserts. That's things when it comes to mental health, like open parks, green spaces, training peer support groups to reduce the need for that. And then it's also looking for ways of engaging the private sector and the nonprofit community to address a lot of those inequities. And I think that with the city's health and hospital core, there is a huge opportunity there to take a healthcare system, one of the nation's largest public healthcare systems, and take it into the 21st century. And that does not involve reinventing the wheel. We can look around the world. We can also look around the country and find new technology companies that are reinventing ways of providing telemedicine, getting pharmaceuticals to people where they don't have to go to a pharmacy. These are all things that we should be learning and then bringing into the city's healthcare system. And on the last thing, going back to the vaccine thing, the vaccine distribution, we can do that as well, looking at models of how they're doing that in other places. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Dianne Morales. In October 2020, a number of candidates for mayor of the city of New York wrote to Governor Cuomo, urging him to release aging people from New York's prisons by using his executive clemency power. According to the letter to the governor, one of the reasons is fiscal in nature, that being that New York taxpayers collectively dole out between $100,000 and $240,000 to incarcerate one elder person per year, as well as the fact that incarcerated elders are significantly more likely to be killed by it. If you are a signatory, please tell us your reasons for signing on. And if you are not, please share with us your views about the governor using his executive clemency power to release elders from New York's jails.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I am in support of that request of the governor. The first thing we'd have to start off with is the idea that, or the recognition that our criminal legal system has disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities, low-income communities over time. And so the elderly that we're referring to are disproportionately Black and brown. And so that's one issue in terms of disparity and inequity that needs to be addressed. You compound that with the health issues and the disproportionate impact from a healthcare perspective that COVID-19 has had on the incarcerated population. And to me, that's a clear signal, both from a moral perspective and a political perspective and an economic perspective, that it would be easiest to release those folks from prison so that they can be healthy and be safe. To say not much about the economic impact at a time where we are increasingly talking about the need for an austerity budget and the need to cut other critical services. This seems to me like a relatively low risk, low-hanging fruit way to address the impending economic challenges while also saving people's lives who historically have been subjected to a criminal legal system that has criminalized Black and brown people, low-income people in a disproportionate way and subjected them to a death sentence. So yes, I support that idea for all of those reasons.
Thank you. And now I'm going to hand off the questions to CRDC's President Mindy Rosier.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. And the topic that I'm going to be doing with you all is going to be on education. I'm a teacher now for almost 24 years, so education is very, very dear to my heart. So starting right off the bat, this question is going to be for Zachary Ischol. It's a little bit of a big intro, but we'll get right into that question. Okay, so charter school conversations have become quite controversial, as they should. For many years, public schools have lost much needed space to these schools. For example, my special needs public school lost a science room, computer room, music room, library, and many other classrooms to a major charter chain here in the city. If their last plan went through via Bloomberg's people, my students would have lost their home away from home. And it was my special needs school that ignited the feud between Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio shortly after he became mayor and overturned decisions that were made previously, as well as speaking out about charter schools. Thanks to certain advocates, the mayor, the UFT, my school was saved, but ultimately the goal was to take over space. My school story is not unique. They have a few classes and then they want to expand. So they play by their own rules despite getting public funding because they're also privately run. So my question, asking for transparency on how they use their tax dollars, as do all public schools in the state, shouldn't be an issue. So they should be held accountable like any other public school in the city. Do you believe that charter school operators should be more transparent about their finances and be held accountable on their student enrollment practices? How would you go about this?
So first off, yes. I also just want to say, though, that I think it is one of the things that's most perplexing to me. And granted, I am new to politics. But how is it that we treat education as a zero-sum game in a city that has the resources that New York City has? It is completely perplexing to me. We treat this as if this is a place that school systems are one that will pick winners and losers. That's a system that has been designed that isn't working. And so I am for more schools. I am for better schools. I am for making sure that we do individually tailored learning plans and programs for every child in the school system to make sure that they have the resource and support they need to excel and overcome the challenges that they're facing. And when it comes to transparency, it is one of the hallmarks of my platform that we will create frameworks for greater transparency across the city government, in particular using technology tools to enable people to see where their dollars are going, both whether we're talking about in the classroom, whether we're talking about law enforcement, whether we're talking about getting our homeless off the street.
Okay, thank you. The next question will be for Dianne Morales. The UFT's United Community Schools program currently operates 31 community schools across the city. These community schools actively work to improve student achievement by addressing educational, emotional, and social and health issues that can stand in the way of learning, which is absolutely needed now more than ever. My school is one of them. How do you plan to support expanding this program?
Thanks for that really important question, Mindy. I should share that I too am a former special education teacher, so this topic is near and dear to me. I believe that it is critical for us to actually provide comprehensive wraparound supports and services to all of our students in all of our schools. It is a critical part of actually providing a quality educational experience. And I think one of the first steps to do that would be by removing police from schools and instead using those dollars to provide a robust menu of additional supports and services for our children. I think that we have long underestimated the role that a lot of community-based organizations and human service organizations can play as partners in supporting those goals and actually pushing into schools to provide supportive services there, as well as expanding and extending the school day. So I would look to actually increase and expand and significantly strengthen the robust menu of services that are provided to children both in school, during the school day, and after school. I think those are all of critical importance.
Okay, thank you. The next question will be for Shaun Donovan. Developing successful schools and strong communities means investing in the well-being of our students, families, educators, and workers. My union sponsors many programs that support their members and their families, build better schools in our neighborhoods, and help students academically, emotionally, and socially. How do you plan on supporting funding for UFT priorities that include the Positive Learning Collaborative, Teacher Center, Brave, Dial a Teacher, Teacher Assistance, as well as, Teacher's Choice, as well as member assistance programs? You're on mute.
Thank you.
You're
Sorry to jump off for a few minutes. You all are keeping us busy. I was going to a union forum and now I'm back here. So thanks for your understanding. And look, not just as a mayoral candidate, but as a dad, I've seen what this year and the longer term challenges can mean to students. And we have to recognize that it's not just enough to think about the education, but also the emotional impacts of, and the trauma, frankly, that our kids have been through. And so that's why when I put out my education plan a few weeks ago, one of the really innovative proposals that I had is to create an education recovery corps. What is that? That is making sure that we're hiring our CUNY students who are going to become teachers, other young folks, high school students who need jobs, to not only help on the educational needs of our students who are recovering from trauma this past year, who are looking ahead at potentially more trauma as the pandemic is getting worse. And at the same time, while we're attending to those needs, creating jobs for those who need it most. Those are the types of investments that we would make. I have an innovative teacher corps proposal that would make sure that we're investing in the training and growth of our teachers, while we're also investing in more diversity for our teachers as well. We have 42% color in a system, 85% kids of color. That has to change.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next set of, it's going to be 3 questions, but I'm going to do the introduction first, and then it's going to be divided into 3 parts. And the first candidate would be Borough President Eric Adams to answer the first part. But when we get there, I'll let you know. Okay, so we have New York City educators wanted to start reopening planning back in April to reopen our buildings from when we were shut down due to COVID. It did not start well into July. Why was that? Because Mayor de Blasio continually said no to us about opening our schools. District 75, which comprises of children with special needs, which is my district, planning didn't finish with that until mid-August. This was a task that we knew was going to be huge, that was going to be complicated, and all this time was wasted. What became glaringly clear was the fact that educators must be part of all decisions regarding our school system, because in April we were ready to go and we had to wait. So for the first part, Mr. Adams, everything was and still is a fight simply for the pure safety of our students and all school staff. We saw how mayoral control proved to be ineffective this year. Do you still support mayoral control of our schools? And if so, what would you do differently? Also, if mayoral control were to be replaced with a different system, how involved would the role be of an educator be? And just in general, where do you see a role of an educator?
I strongly support mayoral control with the caveat we must have, number one, parents participation and educators participating. What we saw over the last few years is, I believe, the failure of 3 C's: clarity, communication, consistency. And this is not just professional for me, it's personal. My significant other is a former principal, and now she trains principals. And she has been really the foundation of my understanding of what happens in the classroom and how we should communicate to get to get the best school system for our young people. But let's be clear on one thing. New York City is not failing all students. New York City is failing Black and Brown students. 65% of Black and Brown students don't meet proficiency level 1s and level 2s. And if we're not honest about that and have a real conversation with our educators to come up with real solutions that are in the classroom every day, we're not going to resolve this issue. Our failure to educate is causing what we see as incarceration in this city, and I will communicate to get it done.
Thank you. The next part of the question will go to Maya Wiley. Teachers are the voices from the ground. We know what works and what doesn't, but yet our voices are so rarely heard still to this day. How would you work with New York City educators? How would you ensure that our voices were actually listened to? You're on mute.
I would work closely and in partnership because we need our educators. I am a parent who spent, if I count up the years for both of my daughters, 15 years in the public system, including navigating, elementary school, the middle school process, and the high school process. And throughout all of it, some of my best and primary supporters were their teachers, including on identifying and solving some of the problems that I needed help as a parent solving in order to support their education. And my aunt was a special education teacher. My cousin's a special education teacher. So I say this because when we implemented this, when we did the School Diversity Advisory Group, which I co-chaired, because we created a partnering process that included the unions, and it also included teachers. We had a special education teacher as part of the group, principals as well, active participants who informed our process, our discussions. We walked in that room, we did not all agree. We set the ground rules that were principled, which were about the outcomes we needed to see for all our children. And it was about all our children. It was an engaged and partnering process. Was it perfect? No, but it did demonstrate just how much we can do when we sit down together at a table, but over time, not just as a once-off conversation. And that's the way I would be mayor.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, and the next part of this question will go to Kathryn Garcia. A great place to look at saving money is eliminating the redundant Department of Education positions that were created in the Bloomberg era. Would you be willing to listen to educators and commit to restructuring the DOE? And what would your priorities be? What would the role of educators be in the day-to-day operations?
Thank you. That is a great question. Philosophically, my policy and program around what we need to do on education is focused on the school building, the resources that principals and teachers need. I would be very willing to cut redundant positions out of the central office, as well as there's like extra chancellors and extra deputy superintendents across the board. We know we're going to be thin. We need to cut out of administration, not out of the classroom. And my sister is a special education teacher who teaches 4th grade. She has had a hellish time. She thinks that she finds out whether or not she goes to work via Twitter. And I am spending a lot of time talking to principals and teachers as we develop our policy goals moving forward. But the center of it is what is best for the classroom, because having teachers in front of kids is where we need to be spending our money.
Okay, thank you. And our final question will go to Controller Stringer. This pandemic has created a public health crisis as well as an economic crisis across the city. City Councilman and head of the Education Committee with the UFT, Mark Traeger, has said Note to leaders and aspiring leaders, you cannot advocate to fully reopen schools and account for trauma and learning loss while pushing for school budget cuts under the guise of tough choices ahead. That won't fly, and we'll fight against school budget cuts tooth and nail again. How do you propose that we protect funding for public schools and avoid cuts during this difficult time?
Well, I think Councilmember Traeger has been a real thought leader on this issue. And I have to just say a couple of things. When I woke up one morning and there was a Daily News op-ed, and it was about how to safely open schools. And I first thought, oh, the school's chancellor wrote this op-ed, only to find out it wasn't the school's chancellor or the mayor, but it was actually the head of the United Federation of Teachers. And I followed with my own plan in July to give parents that certainty and that strategy to keep schools open by basically taking a sledgehammer to the DOE bureaucracy, shifting those resources into classrooms, especially through the lens of building a mental health foundation for the children in the classrooms. And that wasn't done. And we still are not planning educationally for how we're going to get our kids educated post-pandemic. We didn't plan for the schools to open and close and open and close. And I believe that we have to have a different way of doing this. So part of what I would do is make sure that we increase funding. Second, we have got to create a teaching residency program because 40% of our teachers leave teaching after 5 years. We need to partner with mentor teachers and new teachers. We've got to reinvigorate the system. I've done the audits at the Department of Education. I've seen the waste of money because when a chancellor is hired, they bring in their bureaucrats. When a chancellor leaves, another chancellor comes in, adds to the bureaucracy. I think we have to keep more schools open, and it's time to shut down the Tweed Courthouse building, move all those administrators into positions that actually help kids.
Okay. Thank you very much.
By the way, Mindy and everybody, I have to go to another event that was planned a while ago. I'm late because I couldn't just leave, Stephen. So I just want to say goodbye to everybody, and please consider me, and goodbye all candidates. I will see you all very soon, and happy birthday to Ray and all the birthdays that are coming up. I'll see you all around. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I'm going to pass it on to Marissa.
You're on mute,
You're on mute.
Marissa.
Yes, my phone was ringing, so I finally put myself on mute. I'm Marisa Redanti, District Leader in Hell's Kitchen. Hi, everybody. I'm going to start with Dianne Morales. I'm going to start with a really easy question. It's short. How would you lobby the Biden administration for a middle income renter tax deduction for New York City?
How would I lobby? Well, I think that I think that preserving and growing and expanding our middle class is a critical should be a critical part of our recovery, not just from COVID, but certainly from the last administration. And so I think that that's something that needs to happen both at the state level and at the federal level. And I would work with the newly elected supermajority at the state level, which I'm really excited about, to lobby the Biden administration for that. I also think, it's important to note that New York City has a critical role to play in terms of leading on this issue from a national perspective. All eyes are on New York, and how we lead and how we move forward out of this pandemic and into this recovery, and with the new administration is just a critical thing. It'll be a signal to many other cities, and we have the potential to lead in transforming and doing things differently and building a new New York City that's never existed before. And this could certainly be a critical way to begin that as a first step.
Thank you. I neglected to say that my categories are affordable housing and rent and homelessness. I apologize. Eric Adams, Borough President Adams, under Section 8, residents pay 30% of their household income for rent. When the percentage was raised to 30% by President Reagan and David Stockman in 1983 Budget Act, it was done without debate. The traditional suggested guideline for rental and ownership, including mortgage, was 25% of household income. That was considered a good marker to pay for rent and housing. Now, at the time of the change to 30%, the raise, healthcare premiums were low or non-existent, and deductibles were also low. But today, healthcare premiums, copays, and deductibles are a backbreaking expense for New Yorkers. Would you advocate at the federal level, and tell us how you would do this, to reduce the Section 8 contribution back to 25%?
Of course, how we accomplish that is we really need to lean towards our new majority leader in the Senate, and lean towards our amazing congressman in Brooklyn, who's I believe is fifth highest ranking, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. But we need to do more here on a local level. I think we need to re-examine the city FEP's housing voucher program. When it was $1,300, that was fine for a one-bedroom, and $1,500 for a two-bedroom, but that has increased substantially. We invest too much money in the homeless services, where we're spending $124 a night for individuals, $196 for families. We could do a better job by reinvesting in the Advantage type program that we cut under the Bloomberg administration. I think let's save people from being homeless instead of responding after they are homeless, and that's the way to go. So I will advocate my federal lawmakers. We're in charge. 2 Brooklynites are there at a high position. Let's make sure we do the right things for those who are living in an extremely expensive city called New York.
Thank you. Kathryn Garcia, this next question is for you. For the past several years, we've all been talking about we need more affordable housing, and eventually someone brings up, we should have a new Mitchell-Lama program. Now, do you think this is a realistic possibility given our challenges financially in the city of New York? And if yes, if you think it is a possibility, how would you structure it? And if no, what do you think the hurdles would be what kind of program would you create to address the needs of affordable housing for middle-class New Yorkers?
And we do need to have an option for ownership in the city. Mitchell-Lama has been extraordinarily successful in the city of New York, as many of us are aware. And if you got on a list when you were a teenager, you might have an apartment right now. And I know actually someone who did that. But it will be hard. I do think it has to be a priority because we want mixed income communities. We don't want to have warehousing of poor people in one community and wealthy people in another community. We've seen that model and it has not been successful. Capital money will be easier than expense money going forward. The borrowing rate right now is extraordinarily low. There are partnerships and deals to be made with the private sector to get this type of housing built, and in the long run to allow for wealth and equity to be developed, particularly for our Black and Brown communities, where home ownership is the quickest way to closing the wealth gap. So I would be very supportive of a Mitchell-Lama type program moving forward. It will have to be balanced against other programs, but this is an area where we're going to have to make strategic investments, even when we are in a place where there is austerity on many fronts. Thank you.
Thank you. Maya Wiley is next. Even before COVID, those living on the streets would refuse to go into shelters, stating that they were extremely dangerous. And now shelters have been moved to hotels, and a large amount of them are in Hell's Kitchen. And we're witnessing the reality of the dangerous atmosphere of the shelters, which the street homeless have been telling us for years. Mental health services are spotty within some of the shelters. We see open drug dealing, open drug abuse, and robberies are also on the rise. Shelter residents have testified in the media about these safety concerns and problems. What would you do to house the homeless in a safe environment?
So thank you. I spent time with the men at the Lucerne on the Upper West Side, where initially there were some of these problems as well, and where really we saw a model emerge. And it is a model that speaks to supportive housing and the need for the city to do smartly supportive housing, which is people having a key to a door that they can call their own. We should be making that permanent, but with the appropriate support services connected to that housing. And that's what I would do. And let me just say, with New Deal New York, just as we heard our comptroller say, expense borrowing without a plan, as we heard Kathryn Garcia say, capital borrowing different. We have a $10 billion capital construction plan to create 100,000 jobs. But the way we have formulated it is to speak to solving community problems. And this is exactly one of those examples, which is affordable housing that's permanent, that's healthy. I have been talking to homeless experts as well about how we have to transform the way we're approaching our subsidy structure. Because part of what we can do, in addition to aligning our dollars for support services, mental health, addiction related services, is also to recognize that there's so many people who are homeless who just need more subsidy in their housing voucher. And if we're spending $2 billion a year to keep people in unhealthy, dangerous conditions that aren't even permanent housing, but what we can do is increase subsidies, because 1,200 doesn't cut it, and we can do better.
Thank you very much. Shaun Donovan, there you are. Rental assistant demonstration, commonly known as RAD, has been used throughout the country to deal with the rampant disrepair of public housing. Now, what do you think the pros and cons of the program are, especially how it affects tenants, the pros and cons of how RAD affects tenants?
Thanks, Marissa. Let's be very clear first that as we talk about affordable housing, the single most precious affordable housing resource we have in this city is public housing. Deeply affordable. More folks live in public housing in New York than in Atlanta, Georgia. And so we must save public housing. Second, with a $40 billion capital gap, the only way we're going to save public housing is by getting more federal money. I have a plan to invest $2 billion in city capital, but that's not going to get us there. We need federal investment. I'm the only candidate that really knows how to get that done, given my experience as President Obama's HUD secretary, and it is through more Section 8 money. RAD has been used very effectively in other parts of the country because it was implemented differently than in New York. It didn't require privatization. There was long-term ownership by the housing authority and through partnership with nonprofits, and in some cases for-profits. The major problem has been that too many residents have been run through a process that is confusing, that puts them at risk for displacement. That doesn't have to happen. And RAD can be used as an effective tool, but it's not the only tool. I've been working with Greg Russ, and there's an opportunity, as he's put forward, to create a preservation trust using Section 8 money. It's a different pathway to bring Section 8 money in to preserve public housing. But I just finished by saying I'm the only candidate who's actually gotten this done. With mayors across the country, we can do it here in New York too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Zachary
You got a tough job. Thank you for keeping us on track.
Zachary, we're gonna do, this is another short one. Would you fight for home rule? Now, I know that this has gone back and forth about becoming a state thing and just a New York City thing, but what are the biggest challenges now in winning this long sought after legitimate authority in New York City?
I would. I think I just want to touch on something though that came up in when Maya Wiley was talking about affordable housing and homelessness. I think one of the things that we really need to think about when it comes to homelessness is like and this is something that's just one of the reasons I want to touch on it is something that is core to our policy and our platforms, which is that we know that these issues are deeply, deeply interconnected. And in order to address them, we need to foster cooperation across city government, but also with the state and the federal government. And I think when it comes to homelessness in particular, when we look at the amount of money we're spending, $3 billion a year on homelessness, and yet we have more homeless people in our shelters and our streets than at any point in time. And I think part of the problem there is we have a system that is, when it comes to the right to shelter, we are paying to keep people in shelters. We are not providing them the individually tailored services they need to keep them out of shelters, or to get them out of shelters once they are in the shelter system. And so I think it's critically important that we design systems, whether we're talking about education and meeting the needs of students, or whether we're talking about homelessness, we design systems that meet the needs of the individual.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Since there's less candidates, I'm going to pass off the baton to, my gosh, I think it's Paul. Paul, are you next?
I am. Thank you. Thank you all. This will be our last round of questions, and this is going to be on land use issues. And for this round, we are going to start with Kathryn Garcia. Kathryn, after Superstorm Sandy, emergency regulations and changes to the building code were put into place to help in rebuilding of damaged properties. Some of those regulations are now being codified to prepare for future rising water concerns. Here in our neighborhoods, there are many blocks adjacent to the Hudson River that will be impacted by these new regulations. These areas are as divergent as townhouses in West Chelsea Historic District to the yet developed Western Rail Yards at Hudson Yards. What are your thoughts, and what are your thoughts on citywide zoning amendments that have impacts on dramatically different neighborhoods? And do you have any thoughts on this particular zoning text amendment?
Thank you for that question. Zoning is always at the heart of how we are going to grow this city and how we are going to combat the challenges of climate change as we move forward. Doing things across the city that are very broad brush often misserve us as we move forward. We know that we need to protect many areas of Chelsea. I was the incident commander at DEP during Hurricane Sandy, tasked with often pumping things out. I know that actually we lost a tremendous amount of art in Chelsea that was stored there because of the massive flooding that occurred. We need to protect Chelsea, but we need to make sure that it can be done in a way that is affordable and makes sense for the long term, and that we are helping to create connections and investment funds so that people can do that work and make those changes. But we don't want to put financial distress on people right at this particular moment in the middle of a pandemic. So for things that are coming up that have yet to be built, I'm all for you got to go to the max. But we need to work with buildings that are already there that may be 100 years old, and changes to could have real ripple effects within those structures. But fundamentally, we have to protect Chelsea from the next Hurricane Sandy, or as it was, Superstorm Sandy. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Next will be Shaun. And Kathryn just touched on this. In this area, we have some critical historic districts, such as the Gansevoort, Chelsea, West Chelsea historic districts. And there's discussion of creating a Clinton historic district and a Patty Market historic district. There's often a struggle between property owners who want to do what they want to do with their property and preservationists wanting to protect historic aspects of our neighborhoods. What role do you see historic districts play in the fabric of our community? And what priorities would you set for the Landmarks Preservation Commission?
Well, Paul, as someone who lives in and raised my kids in Brownstone, Brooklyn, I understand what it means to value our history as a city. I studied architecture and love cities, love our neighborhoods and the diversity of those neighborhoods in a way that we can never lose. We can't become just like any other city, because if we do, we'll lose what's special about us. But what we have to do is find a way to blend those historic requirements with affordability that ensures that we continue to have an affordable city and continues to find places to build more affordable housing where we're not disrupting that. That's something that I've done my entire career and been able to find solutions because we began by planning with communities, not for communities. I announced my campaign last month at Villa Verde in the South Bronx. You were just asking Kathryn about what to do about flood protection. I led the effort to recover after Sandy when President Obama asked me to do that for the entire federal government. The solution we came up with was to build a worldwide design competition, to bring the best designers, scientists, and others from around the world to bring creative solutions that could ensure that we protected the historic nature of our communities. That didn't mean we have to elevate every building. We could build parks and other infrastructure that beautifully protected those neighborhoods and kept their historic character.
Thank you, Shaun. We're going to move on to Eric. Eric, most cities and counties have long-range plans in place to give planners and developers some foresight into the direction these cities would like to go, and gives guidance on what would likely be approved by the Department of Planning because it fits into a vision for the future. However, New York City has no such plan. Would you advocate for establishing a system for a regular review of 15 to 20-year development forecasts? And what would you say are some priorities that should be in place, thinking of how you would like to see the city in 20 years? Eric, you're muted. Eric Adams.
Thank you. That is the term for 2020. You're muted.
Let's hope it's not for 2040.
It is imperative that we start having long-term planning for our city on number one, those areas that we could develop. And when you look at my plan of 100 steps for New York, you see I talk about everything. How do we plan to look at an agrarian system on growing our food locally? How do we look at the housing process? How do we find other areas to properly build? And we have had our housing program wrong. I believe we've overdeveloped in poor communities, places where there were transportation deserts. We could have done a better job of equalizing where we were building affordable housing. How we look at our waterfront and shore up our waterfront in the southern part of Brooklyn along the Manhattan waterfront. I think long-term planning would allow us to ensure we have local buy-in, similar to some of the things that Gail Brewer has done in Manhattan. And at the same time, we could put our capital resources, our capital dollars into a long-term plan. I 100% believe that. It's taken us too long to implement a real long-term plan for our housing needs.
Great, thank you so much. So Dianne, let's talk about transfer of development rights. Because developers have been known to consolidate zoning lots and then acquiring development rights from adjacent properties in order to build buildings with greater height than might otherwise be acceptable in a particular neighborhood, which makes TDRs seem to be a bad thing. But TDRs have been utilized in Chelsea and along the Hudson River to increase funding for housing needs and refurbishment of the Hudson River Park. What are your thoughts on the transfer of development rights?
So, my thoughts about this actually extend to my thoughts about how we do housing in general in New York City. And I think we need to move away from a speculative market that commodifies housing and centers and prioritizes developers over community. I think for too long, we've allowed our land use process just in general to be dictated by developers and real estate interests instead of really engaging in a comprehensive, long-term, community-led revisioning process. And I think that, the assumption that in order to bring in or to get nice things in our city, private developers have to be subsidized is fundamentally flawed. And I think that we need to think about how it is that we transform that and center the needs of community and the long-term planning, sort of what you started off with in terms of the 20-year outlook, both from an economic perspective for communities and also for the greater good in terms of the housing and the social needs of communities. I think that we need to fundamentally change that. The disparities and the inequities that we see in housing and access to resources today are built on this system, and we need to be willing to commit to changing that in order to get a different outcome moving forward.
Great, thank you. And Zachary, her answers about housing and supposed to CRs leads us into a discussion on over the years, there has been a variety of incentives for developers to provide affordable housing units in new developments, including tax abatements, mandatory inclusionary housing, and 80-20 requirements. But the government is often slower than developers in figuring out ways to manipulate these systems so that we end up with things like poor doors that force legislation to stop that from happening. What do you see as some of the more effective incentives for creating affordable housing units, and what steps will you take to use zoning to create more affordable housing units?
And I just want to make sure that question is for me.
It is, Zachary, thank you.
I thought I heard Zachary. Sorry, only my mom and my stepdaughter call me Zachary. Everybody else is Zach. I know it says it there, but I think we need to change the game with how we look at real estate in this town. The way that it's often done is we talk about tactics. Should we rezone this neighborhood, upzone this neighborhood? What type of AMIs, for-profit, nonprofit development? Should we use vouchers or not? When you pull people together, when you focus on a single objective, and the objective should be no New Yorker should pay more than 25% of their income a month in rent. And then the next question is how do we get there? How much inventory do we need? How much vacancy do we need? And then you can sort of build a city-wide plan that uses all of these tactics and tools to help you get there. One of the things that we really need to flip the script on is that we have a developer process right now that puts the developer first. So if you imagine that you take over, if you're a developer and you come in and you buy a parking lot in Sunset Park, above a subway, adjacent to a fast food restaurant, and you put together a plan for what you're going to do, what AMIs at each level, how much housing you're going to build. You then put it through the city process, the community board. You then are, putting that through a very rigorous multi-year process. I think what we need to do is instead lead with the community. Every community board and at the community level, in addition to the city, puts out what their needs are. How much housing do they need? At what income levels? And then a developer can come in and look at that parking lot and then go to the community board and say, we can take a bite out of 30% of your needs. The other thing is, and I'll make this really quick, and I'm going to go over the time limit really quickly, but the lotto system that usually happens on the tail end, usually after a development is complete, that lotto system should happen on the front end. That way you create a constituency that has equity in the process from the start. It's about changing the politics of how we do development in this town, and that's how you break through. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. I appreciate that. And as a side note, as a community board member, I really appreciate that. So Maya, most of the curbside space in New York City is reserved for free parking of private cars. It's reported there are over 3 million parking spaces, which is estimated to be the equivalent of about 12 central parks of automobile storage. Across the city, less than half of the households have cars, and here in Manhattan, that number is closer to 20%. Would you support changes to allow alternative uses for this public land to support things like trash and bike corrals, open streets for restaurants, or expanded sidewalks? And what steps would you take to implement your ideas? You're muted again, Maya. Sorry, the 2020 line of the year is coming back.
The 2020 line of the year.
Now a 2021 line too.
2021 will be a much better year. So let me just say that I think this is exactly the right kind of conversation to have, particularly when we're talking about both comprehensive planning that includes community and having partnerships with community boards around exactly this kind of question. We need to do two things. We need to recognize, as we did during COVID, just how valuable it is to have open streets, right? And so many communities, and mine was one, South Bronx was one, Jackson Heights. We saw communities all across the city benefit from opening up those streets and seeing our restaurants and other businesses be able to have interaction and create community space. And we know, and we have a lot of communities asking for more protected bike lanes, but also other transportation alternatives, right? And that includes public transit. So I would approach it from both the perspective of partnering with communities, and yes, that includes community boards, it includes local CBOs, includes small businesses around where and how to do that, because it's not a one size fits all, one neighborhood to another. We do need neighborhood engagement across the city, but it's also critically important that we look at it with this long-term lens of the principles of people and what people need long-term. And that includes climate change and resilience to climate, right? That includes the ability to bring back our small businesses, not just to recover from COVID, but to reimagine our cities. And it does mean a recognition that we need to create more transit alternatives. And I would approach it that way.
Thank you so much. That's terrific. That concludes our round of questions. We're now going to move to closing statements from the candidates. We are going to run a couple of minutes over time, so I appreciate everybody if you could stay tuned, but we're only 7 minutes from the end. So for closing statements, we're going to start with Shaun Donovan.
I think I'm off mute now. Thank you all for joining today. Thank you in a year where we have seen our democracy at risk, for your work to make democracy work here in New York. I want to close by talking about the moment that we find this city in. And this is a moment where we must repair and rebuild our city. But as President Obama used to say to us all the time in moments of crisis, we cannot let this crisis go to waste. Over my career working to rebuild from crisis, I have looked in too many families' eyes who've lost their homes to foreclosure, who've lost their entire communities to hurricanes and storms like Sandy. And I've looked in the eyes of many others. And what I've seen is not just the pain of loss, but the potential for resilience and rebuilding. When everything we see around us we know is fragile, we know that we can rebuild differently and better. We must reimagine this as a city that works for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun. Next will be Zach. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So there's something remarkable about this year's mayor's election. It's the first time kids born after 9/11 are going to vote for mayor of New York City. We talk about this moment. This moment for them has been going on their entire lives. You know, their lives started in the tragedy of 9/11, multiple wars. I have friends I deployed with who are still deployed downrange. They saw, you know, economic difficulties at the dinner table in 2008 that continue to this day. The effects of climate change firsthand with Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, the fires out west. Now you can't make this up. These kids are living through a global pandemic, the economic and social consequences that will come next. The complete political circus that is happening in this country. It is heartbreaking and we need to do better. And I think doing better can start in a town like New York City. And doing that is going to require bringing all elements of the city together, from the city government, the state, the federal government, also the nonprofit sector, and also the business community. I have worked in business, I have worked in the nonprofit sector, and I have worked in government. Thank you. And also thank you all to the candidates. It's great to see you all here. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate that. Maya, how would you like to close?
Well, first, I want to thank our hosts. This was such a thoughtful and well-organized forum. So thank you for that. Questions were outstanding. Let me just say that I have, as a Black woman, as the child of activists, as someone who went to a segregated school for my early years, as someone who watched my community displaced, as someone who has only ever wanted to live in New York City, I'm running as someone who has spent my entire career fighting for transformation and working against the technocratic. And part of what I saw in city government when I had the great good fortune to be the first Black woman to serve as counsel to New York City mayor, was the incredible opportunity of making more transformative change that city government has. And it won't happen if we take the path of politics and of least resistance, but only if we partner with one another for exactly what all our communities and all our people need. And I will lead in partnership. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Kathryn.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for giving your time to put together this Zoom forum. It was very well run, and we have some experience in this. I am Kathryn Garcia, and look, I am running because I have the experience to ensure that we meet this crisis head on. I have been called on time and time again, literally fire, floods, food, to ensure that we were serving New York City residents. And I have a vision for how we grow our economy that is inclusive, that is about economic mobility, that is about every child fulfilling their dreams. I want to continue to be of service to New York City residents, as I have been for the last 14 years, and I hope to earn the endorsement of your Democratic Club. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. Dianne?
I want to echo my fellow candidates' claims about how extraordinary this forum has been. Thank you very much. I'm going to start off with a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, as he said, "We must recognize that we can't solve our problems now until there's a radical redistribution of economic and political power." Thoughts, prayers, and rhetoric alone are not going to create fairness, justice, and equity for us all. It's time for us to demand a politics for all people because our system is not broken. It's working as it was designed to work. We're at a crossroads of unprecedented times and unlimited possibilities for a radical reimagining of who we can be as a city. And that means not going back to normal. It means living up to our aspirations and truly becoming the greatest city in the world. New York City needs leadership that's unapologetic about the need for us to create this new social contract, to center and elevate our working class and our vulnerable communities. Anything less should not be good enough. I look forward to leading New York City into this new day and this new possibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Dianne. And Eric, you get to take us home.
Thank you so much. And I really want to encourage people to go to my website, www.ericadams2021.com, 100 plus steps forward for New York City. Let's be clear, our city is dysfunctional, and at the center of every city lies all of its agencies. And if those agencies are not aligned with each other, it doesn't matter how many tax dollars we put into our city, it will continue to produce a dysfunctional product. We saw how we turned around public safety in the city, where every car had a no radio sign in the early 80s to a place that we can be safe. Let's get there again. I know what the city can do. And I too know a quote by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. We spend a lifetime pulling people out of the river. No one goes upstream and prevent them from falling in the first place. I'm going to take New York City governing upstream. We're going to prevent the crisis and not feed the crisis.
Thank you so much, Eric. So that will conclude our round with the candidates. I'd like to thank the candidates for their time today, especially given that there were some that stayed, and I particularly appreciate those of you who stayed with us through the end of it. I'd like to thank the co-organizers of this event, both Nick and Mindy as presidents of the clubs, and Marisa and Sylvia and Stephen as my co-district leaders in the 75th district. So thank you very much. I also want to thank the close to 150 people who stayed online with us. And I want to point out that Broadway Democratic Club of the 69th Assembly District also joined us. So I'd like to thank Paula and Amy and Curtis for their help in bringing participants to this. I want to remind everybody in the audience that the Hell's Kitchen Democrats will be doing our endorsements on February 4th. CRDC will be doing their endorsements on February 18th, and Broadway Democrats will be doing their endorsements on February 11th. This is our last of 5 candidate forums. So if anybody missed this, or if you're on now and you know someone who didn't come today, share the links to our previous forums so you're well informed for our endorsement meetings. So that concludes it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Well.
Thank you.
All of you.
Thank you.